Be melon jolly, not melancholy. Summer is ripe for fun, and some Booster Juice bestsellers are back in season. Watermelon smoothies, including the refreshing Watermelon Wave, a berry burst of strawberries, raspberries, pomegranate, and vanilla frozen yogurt, and fan favorite, Watermelon Explosion, a refreshing burst of bananas, mangoes, and pineapple, both made with watermelon sorbet and probiotic yogurt. All of the watermelon, none of the seeds. Visit a Booster Juice near you today or download the Booster Rewards app.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
You know the phrase by now. It's uttered by everyone, from politicians who are after your vote, to your fellow citizens suffering from sheer frustration, or even just comics looking for a laugh.
After 9 years of this prime minister, everything is broken.
Everything's broken. Everything feels broken.
Everything feels broken.
But when he says that Canada is broken, that's where we draw the line.
In the ERs that remain open, wait times have never been longer.
It may seem like there's a lot of places to shop in Canada, but all these stores are owned by just 3 big companies.
There's extreme partisanship and extreme polarization.
A new poll says that the majority of Canadians feel that Canada is broken. What? Just because the stock market is down, the railroad is on fire, and the Leafs lost to a Zamboni driver?
We're going to let Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre argue over if this country is entirely broken or not. But as we cover the news in Canada, it has become very clear to us here at The Big Story that some of the systems we rely on are faltering, to say the least. And rather than use that to try and grab some downloads or score a few political points, we thought we'd ask some of the smartest people in their respective fields a few simple questions. Starting with this: is it broken? If it is, how do we fix it? Welcome to Fixing Canada, a special series running all this week on The Big Story. Today, transportation. A system that you only notice when it breaks. Think about it. How often do you think back fondly to that time the bus got you right to work, or you were easily able to tap your credit card to pay? Now, when a 20-minute commute turns into an hour-long nightmare, or you have to buy a whole new card just to ride a specific route, you talk about those times. Is Canada's transit, both public networks inside of cities and larger routes between them, truly as bad as it can sometimes seem? And either way, how could it be better? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is Fixing Canada on The Big Story. Rhys Martin is the creator and host of RM Transit, a YouTube channel that focuses on the intricate details of public transport systems around the world. Hey, Rhys.
Hi, Jordan. Thanks for having me on.
You're most welcome, and this will not, I promise, be a negative conversation because this week is all about solutions, but we have to begin with context. How does transit in Canada stack up to countries around the world?
I think it's actually quite good, is the honest truth. I think when we get bogged down in the details of, individual projects or how, your individual ride on the bus or train goes, it's not always as rosy. But I think the reality of public transit is there's a really wide surface area to users. You see it even if you're not using it. And when you're using it, there's a million things that can go wrong. And so it's very easy to get the perception that things aren't working. But when you look at things like the amount of people, the percentage that commute using public transport, Canada actually does pretty well. We're not the best of the best up with places like Hong Kong, Japan, Switzerland, but we are actually, more in line with some European countries like the Netherlands and Belgium than we are with like the United States, which is pretty good, I think.
That's amazing to hear because one of the reasons that we wanted to do this week is because the refrain "Canada is broken" seems to be everywhere at the moment on both sides of the aisle. And
Absolutely,
I think
yeah.
transit is one of the tangible frustrations that people can experience with public systems not working, maybe?
I think it is tangible, and I think that's why people point to it. Look, I cover public transit, as you said, all around the world. And no matter what place I'm covering, from Warsaw to Berlin to Sao Paulo, every place you go to, you will get a lot of people who say the system here is bad.
Right.
Short of maybe Japan and Switzerland, everyone thinks their system is worse than it is. And that's because when you spend your time, and people do spend a lot of time commuting, it's very easy to pick up on bad things, right? You know, when you're sitting on a bus or train for an hour every day, as a lot of people do, then you're naturally going to be exposed to the problems in your own city. And when you go and visit another place, I think you're more likely to shrug it off and say, oh, it's a bad day or something like that. And so I just think it's a psychological perception. There are a lot of things we could do much better and that we should do much better, and we can talk about that. But I think that public transport on the whole, you know, it shows up for the most part, and our systems work for the most part.
What about on a larger scale in terms of intercity transit? We've covered this stuff on this show before, and one of the things that we want to make sure we do is also address rural listeners. And I mean, I know one of the very first episodes that we did way back when we launched this show was about the Greyhound buses disappearing. How does Canada do in terms of getting people in between cities, which obviously kind of a unique challenge for us being so large?
I mean, I think that's what it ultimately comes down to, right? Is that Canada is a very large country, you know, without real parallel in the world. You know, Russia is bigger, has a bigger population. Australia is smaller, has a smaller population. In all of these places, intercity transport is a challenge, ultimately. And, you know, the fact that we don't have the Greyhound buses anymore is a real problem. And, you know, it's a place where I think a country that was more progressive than Canada would have said, you know, we're going to step in and backstop this network, or at least provide a basic level of intercity bus service so that people who rely on that can get around. And at the same time, we do have places in the country where there are a lot of people are concentrated along corridors. And in a more progressive country, I also think that we would have gotten on with building better intercity transport solutions sooner. But that being said, you know, we do have options. And so are we the world leader? Absolutely not. But things could certainly be much worse.
That's the week we're looking for. The things could certainly be much worse week.
Exactly.
You mentioned a few countries off the top of your head there that were real world leaders in public transit. What are those countries and what are they doing that we could learn from?
When I think about countries that we could learn a lot from, I think the places to look to are, you know, the classics. Places like Scandinavia, but also places in East Asia, like Korea, for example. I think Korea is such an interesting story of ascendancy. You know, they were not a super developed country a couple decades ago, and now they have, you know, often very good public services. And so for things like rail transport, but also excellent bus transport, looking at a country like Korea is, I think, very interesting, especially because while Korea is not physically large, it has a similar population to Canada and arguably more challenging geography because it is highly mountainous in a way that a lot of Canada is not highly mountainous. You know, it's flat and expansive. So I think it's a good example to look to. But again, I also think the Nordic countries, you know, Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden are great examples to look to. They are small countries, not quite as big as Canada, but they are similar in the sense that they're quite sparsely populated. They're northernly, so they have not totally dissimilar climates. They have kind of, you know, a social democratic state. So I think that these places are good to look to. But I also just think in general, we need to train ourselves not to only look to the United States. Right. I know that's kind of the classic thing. Canadians always look to the US to compare, and maybe the UK as well. And I think getting out of just English-speaking countries would be really helpful for us.
When you look at Korea or those Scandinavian countries, one of the things that we told ourselves when we kind of began planning for this week is that we wouldn't let the answers to these questions be like, well, we just need to throw more money at it. Let's assume that whichever government is in power is committed to funding it at a decent level. What beyond that makes for a successful modern transit system?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think that it's important that we distinguish a few things. First, Canada actually spends a lot of money on public transit, at least on building it. We have some of the biggest transit expansion budgets in the world in some of our big cities. And so I think that what we've become a bit confused about is that governments are spending tons of money. Obviously, the Prime Minister recently announced even more money as part of the kind of public transit fund. The issue is that there needs to be a balance of building new stuff, i.e. capital funding, and also running the systems, which is operating funding. And what we often see is there's a tendency towards building stuff because you get to cut ribbons, you get to create something visible. Whereas the basics, just running the service, having trains or buses that operate, it's a lot harder to see. If the number of buses out on the streets of Toronto or out on the streets of Medicine Hat doubles, I don't think people generally are going to notice, but the actual public transit service will dramatically improve. And so I think that so much of the conversation we need to be having is about how, as a society, we can prioritize things that aren't always visible to people. A lot of public transit is hard work that doesn't get a lot of credit. And so I think that talking about things like maintaining the systems we have, having coherent policies around how public transit operates, having frequent service, these are basics, but these are things that in many places we still don't get right. And so I think that on a fundamental level, doing those things is really important. And then, on a society-wide level, I think we need to have more conversations about how we can kind of normalize public transport use, making it so that people who are in urban areas at least get exposed to it.
Right.
When people are kids and they're young, they at least, take some trips on the bus or on the train system in their city so they can at least get used to it and they can learn to relate to people who might not get around in a car and just, having those options and having that comfortableness with alternative ways of getting around is so important. And I think it's something that in other countries, people definitely experience more widely.
I'm going to approach this maybe just more from a cynic's perspective to get your answer on it, because one of the things you mentioned is, we have a bunch of large projects and we have a lot of money going into funding them. I think a lot of people would look at some of those large projects and say that either we haven't seen them deliver yet, as in the case of in Toronto, maybe with the Eglinton Crosstown, which is still under construction, or where we have put money into them, they don't work properly. And I know lots of people would be familiar with the mess that is the Ottawa LRT. And we've even done a couple of episodes of this show about the significant problems that Via Rail is having moving people between cities. So if the underlying grid of the network is actually pretty good, what's wrong with these high-profile projects?
Well, I think there's been a lot of things. And I think that those projects highlight exactly the point that, we spend a lot of money on them. And as you said, they're not delivering for us. And so the solution clearly can't just be to spend more. I think that what we need to do is we need to kind of go back to basics. Canada used to be pretty good at building stuff. Back in the kind of 80s and 70s, in Toronto in particular, we used to build subways at prices that were similar to countries like Germany and France that are still really good at building these things. And over the years, through a combination of not being consistent, and so what that does is that forces people who are experts in these subjects to move to other places or to get into other industries. We've lost knowledge there. And then we haven't been consistent with our reforms. We've moved towards things like public-private partnerships, which when you look around the world, they are not commonly associated with a lot of successful transit countries. Sometimes cities will dabble with them, but they usually go back to kind of a what I would call a government-led model. And that tends to be what's successful. And so despite the fact that we've been doing things like this, we've been changing our policies and we've been having bad outcomes, it doesn't seem like we've really come around to the idea that maybe we need to go back to doing things the way we used to. And I think that this really comes down to, as I said before, our tendency to look to the United States and the United Kingdom. And what's funny is that, I think people think the UK, at least, like they have a better transit system than us probably, but that's actually not true. In London, there is a really large transit system that is excellent. But if you look at the rest of the UK, I think a lot of people would say that actually their local bus services and their train services, not intercity, but within urban areas, are not as good as a lot of Canadian cities. If you were to compare, say, Manchester with Vancouver or Montreal, I think Manchester would handily lose that fight. And so I think that we look to countries that aren't actually very successful with public transit just because we have the same language and we have this cultural affinity. And that really blocks us from being able to kind of find a successful path forward that leads us to the kind of world that we want to live in.
Even if our network is generally functional and not bad compared to the rest of the world, how do we stack up in terms of innovation? And I ask this because I think if you approached a lot of Canadians about what they see elsewhere in the world that we don't have, the first thing that pops up, of course, is like high-speed trains and these sort of futuristic type of transit networks that Canada's can often pale in comparison to, just at least optically,
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's a great question. And high-speed rail is one of those things, along with maybe like the huge subway networks that people imagine, the kind of spaghetti bowl map type of things. People see it and they say, why can't we have that? And I think that a lot of it actually comes back to things like the way you phrase that, which is innovation, right? And I think that what's so interesting is that at one point in time, maybe in like the 1970s, 80s, high-speed rail was this cutting-edge, innovative technology. These days, high-speed rail it's kind of boring.
Huh.
A lot of countries have managed to build it, and it's become a kind of standardized product. So to give you examples, Morocco has high-speed rail. Indonesia has high-speed rail. Turkey has high-speed rail. It's no longer just a thing that rich countries, G7 countries have. It's become something that is quite common infrastructure around the world. And the reason that it gets built in some places and not in others is, I think, a combination of sort of national vision that, like, this is clearly a technology of the future and we should be investing in it. But it's also that they've kind of laid the groundwork, right? If you have an existing railway system, you kind of build up on that. And eventually you say, well, we need something faster. And so you build a high-speed rail. But, when your culture is kind of saying, oh, we just have to jump to the best technology and we have to kind of skip on the urban transit and the other things, I think it's hard to get there. I think having these established experts in our public organizations, like as I mentioned with urban transit, having those in political positions and in government can help us shape these kind of policies at a national level. I think it's kind of a back to basics thing. So we need to fund projects like this, and we need to vote in politicians who will not only fund projects like this, but who will enact policy that will make it so that we can build these projects without it, being a California situation with California high-speed rail or the UK's high-speed 2, which are these bold projects to build high-speed rail, but that have been, mired in controversy and super expensive.
With that in mind, then, when it comes to innovation, to use a phrase that our prime minister has been using a ton as he tries to lay out his vision, if we were going to skate to where the puck is going on transit, what would we be looking at now that will be innovative 10, 15, 20 years down the line?
Well, I think that the thing that we really need to do is we need to bring more people onto transit services. And I think we need to create more national level standardization. So the thing that makes transit in a place like Korea or Japan or Switzerland so amazing is that it's really integrated at a national level. And so what I mean by that is that you often can use the same methods of payment, across the entire country. The timetables and the maps, they use the same design style. They are accessible in the same way. And so what it does is, instead of creating all of these little fiefdoms across the country, and sometimes even across cities, if we look at Toronto, there's like 10 different transit agencies, you have a sort of national level infrastructure that is public transit that makes it easy for people anywhere in the country to kind of drop into a new city or a different location and easily use the system. And so I think that's a huge element of it. And I also think it's expanding a basic level of consistent good service everywhere. So, if you're in Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver, you probably can walk down the street and get on a pretty frequent, reliable bus service. But we need to have that level of bus service before we even think about, higher orders of transit. We need to have that everywhere. So, in small cities, there should be a couple frequent bus lines. And in our larger cities like Calgary, Ottawa, Winnipeg, there should be kind of comprehensive, frequent transit. I think that the general rule of thumb should be transit is not good enough in a big city if you can't live without a car, and it's not good enough in a small city if you can't live with one car. And so I think thinking about things like that is how we can guide ourselves to being a sort of leader in public transit and creating a system that is, in a sense, innovative in that it makes public transit something that sort of fades into the background. It just becomes like electricity or sewer service, just something people expect to exist, and they don't need to even think about using it. It's just obvious.
Are there any places in Canada right now that stand out to you as leading the way in a manner in which other Canadian cities could emulate?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that there's a couple. So I'll give you two examples I like. One is Brampton in Ontario. So Brampton is a suburb of Toronto. And what it's done over the last couple of years is it's implemented this really frequent system of express buses combined with local buses. And it doesn't sound particularly fancy, but the buses are new and shiny and nice. And there's nice stops that are enclosed so people can wait out of the elements. And there's little screens that tell you when your bus is coming. And just by instituting this with frequent service and honestly, not a whole lot else, there's a little bit of bus lane here and there, but it's not even like fancy bus lanes everywhere like you might have seen in some cities. The city has seen its transit ridership go up enormously over the past 5 years. In fact, it's basically similar to Toronto on a sort of per capita basis and even exceeding Toronto now in some metrics. And they just did it on the back of basic service, just frequent buses, easy to understand across the whole city. And then the other example I would use is Metro Vancouver. You know, Metro Vancouver is not perfect in its transit, but when people experience it, you know, that I know from internationally, and they come to Vancouver, they say, you know, it does kind of feel like Europe or Asia here. The signage is well designed. The services run frequently. The SkyTrain network, so the subway is driverless, so it can run every couple of minutes all the time, even late at night. It creates this very simple system that's very recognizable and easy to use and comprehensive. And there's tons of transit-oriented development that people, you know, are suddenly talking about this because of the housing crisis. But Metro Vancouver has been putting dense housing around transit since transit has existed and since the SkyTrain has existed, certainly. And so I think it's a model in terms of how we shape our cities and also how we think about the system as a whole.
Last question. You know, we've talked about a number of projects that are underway in Canada. Leaving aside anything that we might do from this point on, what do you think transit in this country will look like in a decade?
I think it'll be a lot more comprehensive. I think more people will have access to a sort of high level of service. So the reach of transit should expand out quite a bit. I think it will become a bit more, you know, nationally integrated. A lot of systems are starting to let you pay with just your credit or debit card. And that sort of creates that universal form of payment so that people can land, because they're probably not going to be taking a train in the next 10 years in some, you know, random city in Canada. And hopefully they can just get on a bus and it's like, oh, I just pay the same way I would pay in any other city. I just tap my debit card. And so I think that that's a huge thing. And then I also just hope that we talk about expanding those basic frequent services, things like buses, out to more of our cities. Infrastructure is great, and we certainly need to build it, but all of the infrastructure in the world isn't worth very much if it doesn't provide a frequent service, and certainly if it's not a reliable service. So I think solving those things and then getting back to figuring out our problems so that the next round of projects, they are not only delivered faster, but they're delivered for less money, and they actually produce results. They're not constantly shut down or having problems.
Rhys, thank you so much for this.
Thanks for having me on.
Rhys Martin is the creator and host of RM Transit. That was The Big Story. For more from us, including all the episodes this week, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca, or you can stay in the feed that you're in right now. They'll be there too. You can send us feedback on this week or any other themed week we've done or any other themed week we should do by shooting us an email to hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by calling us and leaving a voicemail, 416-935-5935. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.